Okay, hi, welcome to the Week 6 lectures in SOA1010. This week we're looking at the concept of youth. So I'll be recording three videos for this topic. The introduction to youth, where I'll just broadly discuss the topic. Then I'll look at two separate but increasingly interrelated ways of looking at young people's lives, and two important areas of what we call youth studies, which is youth cultures and youth transitions. In the youth culture section, you'll see that I'll bring in some of the stuff we've been looking at in the previous weeks on class and consumption, and then in youth transitions, I'll introduce some new ideas, particularly around the ideas of Ulrich Beck and around risk and reflexivity. But to start this first section, I think an entertaining start for it will be to have a look at the video snippet I've got that link to there, so I'll get you to stop and have a look at that. Basically what that is, it's an old Chaser show. It's probably, I don't know, over 10 years old now, this snippet, and it's a humorous kind of parody or satire of the way that young people are treated on current affairs type programs, such as A Current Affair and what used to be Today Tonight and those other shows. I think it's through the kind of piss-taking that happens in this video, I think it does a really good job of making the normal look strange, and I suppose critiquing the moral panic aspect of of the way young people are represented, that I'll look at in the first video. So please stop now and have a quick look at that. Okay, so what is youth? In terms of an age bracket, officially in places like Centrelink and I don't know, even the United Nations, it's like 15 to 25 or 15 to 28. So it's like a age bracket in a way that you're engaged with institutions, and you're treated differently by institutions when you're in that age as opposed to when you're older. But also more broadly, youth has a particular kind of social meaning. You know, the fountain of youth, people want to kind of remain young. Youth is something that's mined and kind of sold to us through advertising. Advertising tends to use kind of, you know, young, funky, cool, sexy young people to sell stuff. But also there's a kind of social and political usage of youth that youth studies scholars are quite concerned about, the way that their kind of lives are distorted, the ways that young people are often blamed for social problems that they have very little social control over. So you can see here, you know, there's constant moral panics about young people, and this often happens through generational relationships. As people get older, they seem to, you know, start to be more offended or denigrate the young people, even though they probably went through that thing themselves. So you get stuff, you know, each new young generation's narcissistic and lazy and politically irresponsible and eats too much avocado and therefore can't buy a house. And all these things tend to ignore the actual social, economic and political situations that young people face. So this seems to happen forever. I mean, the quote there from Socrates, you know, back millennia ago, talk about how, again, them older people were denigrating young people for, you know, not living life properly. A constant trope in this is like older people today will have negative things to say about young people's pop culture, particularly music, you know, how apparently it's empty and flash and vulgar and all that kind of thing. And back in my day, it was, you know, much more meaningful, you know. But, you know, those comparisons tend to be shown to be quite absurd when you actually look at them, and I think the silly meme there kind of illustrates that quite well. So youth is this kind of age bracket in reality, and I'll talk about how that age bracket itself is kind of increasingly meaningless in the third lecture. But it also, as youth is kind of disembodied from actual young people, becomes this kind of thing that people debate through and about other things. So it kind of occupies a kind of intriguing place in the popular imagination. Older generations seem to consistently bemoan and whinge about newer generations, and in particular I'll be kind of highlighting the moral panic stuff in the media, so there's a way of kind of illustrating that. But there's a juxtaposition between the kind of constant barrage of critique of young people, and in the same way they're kind of idealised as being beautiful, full of life. There's this weird temporal relationship when it comes to young people. As people get older, they kind of romanticise their own youth, you know, have all these kind of, you know, what are often nostalgic memories about good things that happen with their young. But young people also kind of represent the future they're idealised and kind of seen as a hope for the future. So there's this weird juxtaposition politically where young people are often seen as being politically apathetic and don't care enough about stuff. But whenever they do, they get out there and protest, they're seen as dangerous or as doing the wrong thing and, should be at school worrying about their own individual futures. So youth becomes this object where kind of there's a whole bunch of kind of social, political, cultural debates, tensions and struggles that kind of argued about through. So Bourdieu, who I've been talking about a bit over the last couple of weeks, has a little kind of almost like an opinion piece that he wrote about young people, and talks about how the very concept of youth in many ways itself is an example of symbolic violence. Now, what does he mean by that? Sure, there's this group of people in any kind of society that's between these certain ages, but to render them as the same, as like this generation and narcissistic or whatever, is a kind of abuse of language in a way, because there's so many differences of, situation between young people in that group that it's a really very much a kind of misnomer to kind of treat people the same in that age group. So again, this relates to the problems of generations that Mannheim wrote about a long time ago in the 20th century. And Mannheim talks about how people are born in the world at different times, therefore they will have kind of similar affinities towards things. They're certainly not the same, but they'll have a relationship to kind of, say, technology or a war that will be different than previous generations, and therefore there will be some shared kind of consciousness there going on, but really, as Bourdieu points out, there's a lot of differences going on as well. So this is kind of a tension in youth studies around the very idea of generations. There's critique about whether it's useful to kind of think about the lives of young people because it's too generalised, and there's other kind of ways of looking at, they say, it is useful to kind of consider the economic, cultural, political circumstances of young people, as long as you are acknowledging the differences going on within that, and things like class, race and gender, and the kind of sociological ways of doing that. So we've talked in earlier weeks about different kind of theoretical perspectives. From a more functional perspective, youth are kind of seen as that kind of, hope for the future in many ways. So therefore, they're the kind of object of social institutions to be moulded, to be disciplined, to become good workers, good citizens, to try and make the future good. This means that there's kind of distinctions made between, normal and abnormal, normal and deviant, and from functional perspectives, the kind of more deviant, risky youth need to be kind of, managed, taught and trained to be better. So deviant youth must be controlled and re-socialised so they can conform, and so that means the society itself can kind of function in a more efficient way. Now again, I think this makes a lot of sense, but from a critical perspective or a conflict perspective, which is where my work is more situated, it shows that there's a kind of, there's a lot of kind of injustice in that point of view, in the sense that, some young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds, the more racialised backgrounds, male versus female perspectives, are more exposed to various kinds of risks, more exposed to various kinds of marginalisation. Therefore, the idea that they can make kind of free choices to be good or whatever in some kind of social vacuum is really a distortion of the actual situation. So from the conflict perspective, youth are seen as the age cohort or generation that most strongly challenges the hegemony of the capitalist class, and therefore they're more likely to be the ones and the object of those kind of disciplinary techniques. So here, young people kind of see the world with new eyes. They can, create new things, and are therefore under constant pressure to conform. And this is a kind of bad thing, I suppose, from the conflict perspective. So I'm going to briefly kind of use the concept of moral panics to talk about some of the things I've been hinting towards so far. So the theory of moral panic was developed by Stanley Cohen, and it's a way of thinking about the way the media represents things. It's not all always about young people. There's moral panics about, Islam, moral panics about all kinds of different aspects of our lives. But it's come particularly important to analyse the relationship of kind of older people to younger people, and also the ways that kind of cultures change over time. So I think that to start, again, stop and have a look at the Old Today Tonight story there on emo, and a content warning there that story does contain material about self-harm and violence and suicide. So I think this is a kind of almost perfect example of the moral panic perspective, where a particular young person's subculture is then blamed for violence and suicide. So have a quick look at that, and then I'll talk a little bit more about it. So yeah, in that story you can see that like this almost starts off with a kind of sensible analysis, and then it very quickly turns into the sensational. You can see the kind of so-called expert there, you know, wondering why young people don't just do the nice things that they've always done, which again is very much a kind of naive point of view. It's always kind of think of what does that person think that young people do in their day lives, like play with hula hoops and collect stamps or something. So this moral panic perspective tends to thoroughly distort the reality of what's going on, and it does so for particular political purposes. Stanley Cohen developed this idea, and I'll go into some kind of more critique now of understanding that. Cohen developed the idea of moral panics around a kind of famous clash between the Mods and the Rockers on Brighton Beach. I think it was in 1964. And he shows that the representation of that event was, you know, hugely sensationalized, hugely overemphasized, made much more out of it, what was actually going on. But then this process happened that made it even bigger. So these panics are often about forms of deviance, but also not so much deviance, more so in terms of just kind of basic lifestyle choices. Many of the things that moral panics are about are kind of just the grist of everyday life for young people. So they range in kind of content from being about, you know, particular subcultures, and, you know, with punk it was goths, then it was emos, and, you know, the list goes on forever. There's panics over different choices that young people do and different stuff they do in their day-to-day lives, particularly bound up with kind of, you know, sex, drugs and rock and roll kind of rites of passage. And there's also lots of moral panics about threats to young people, particularly adult predatory behaviour. And this is particularly done now through moral panics around the internet and social media usage. So how does this work? So Cohen highlights that there's an initial problem. So a thing happens, and often the thing does happen. It's not necessarily kind of completely made up. But then it's reported, and the way that it's reported is often deeply over-exaggerated, deeply sensationalized, or oversimplified. So what happens then is that all these experts come out and say, well, this problem needs to be solved this way. You know, you get politicians saying this, and psychologists saying that, and sociologists saying this, and you know, opinion writers writing whatever they want to say about it. And then what often happens then is the original target of the moral panic reacts against that distortion. But the irony here is that reaction then is used as a kind of proof of the initial deviance. So there's an escalation process. This amplifies, and this kind of creates a kind of thing that happens over months. Now, in terms of the politics of this, the result tends to be more regulation, more intervention, more laws, essentially just more and more kind of control of young people in particular. So this operates in a kind of social control culture, and like the moral entrepreneurs, whether it's priests or psychologists or cops or politicians or whatever, it's their points of view that are the ones that become to dominate public policy, and it, you know, from the youth studies perspective, doesn't necessarily have a lot of kind of good things in terms of what this means for young people. More and more constraints, more and more control. So there's a polarization effect that happens here. The offenders in this process, offenders in inverted commas, don't like the way they were represented, but this, you know, they react in particularly youthful, deviant ways, and this then kind of creates further reporting. This relies on stereotypes, misnomers, misrepresentations, a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that goes on here that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Now, what's interesting about this is that Cohen's work in a way looks kind of quaint now, in the sense that moral panics kind of happened episodically in the way that Cohen was writing, that there'd be one this week and then that'd kind of die out and there'd be a different one next week. But more recent theorists have started to talk about how moral panics may be like permanent, that the media in particular is just constantly creating them, and it's almost like that process that I just sketched out that Cohen was using as a critique has become like an instruction manual for journalists to do their jobs. So To sum up this in terms of representation of young people's lives, young people aren't really in the media, for instance. They take up positions maybe in their late 20s or whatever, and the people that do that tend to be from kind of relatively privileged middle class backgrounds. And so what happens here is that young people don't have a voice in the media, their lives are not particularly well understood, particularly the social and economic constraints on young people are very rarely represented in the media, and so their lives are distorted and kind of displayed in a sensational manner to kind of sell newspapers, sell advertising and to garner clicks. Okay, I'll leave it there, and in the second part of the video I'll talk more specifically about youth culture.